The human species is changing now more than ever. Well, there was a period in the 1940s where... Never mind. Today, we're talking about selective pressure. But first, eugenics. It is the practice of selective breeding to improve a species and has been used in farming for thousands of years. In the United States, the rediscovery of Mendel's laws in 1900 led to hopes that genetics could improve crops and livestock, which would increase agricultural production. Now, even before a failed Austrian painter began his endeavors, eugenics was actually being practiced on humans in the United States.
Did you know that there was actually an Indiana eugenics law that forced certain individuals under state custody to be sterilized against their will? And by 1924, around 15 other states had passed similar laws too. And you know, around this time, average individuals shared these same notions too. According to a study by Fortune magazine, around 66% of respondents supported the idea of sterilizing the mental defectives, and over 63% of criminals. I guess it just managed to slip under the rug that 64,000 people were sterilized against their will in the United States.
Although the Austrian painter had taken eugenics to a new level, to him it wasn't just about eradicating certain behavioral genes, it was also about aesthetics. You know, not having blonde hair, blue eyes. In hindsight, everybody sees how wrong and immoral this was, and they not only condemn how this Austrian painter went about it, but they also condemn the general idea of perceiving genes as superior or inferior. Meanwhile, whether it's subconscious or not, all of you actually have this perception, and it's not your fault. Whether it's wrong or not, it's not something that you have control over, unfortunately. Now, this is a bold claim, but let me ask you something. Do you have any control over who you're attracted to? For example, no matter how hard society pushes a certain agenda, like body positivity, it doesn't make your perception of certain individuals change all of a sudden because of society. You're not going to find certain individuals more attractive. This is something deep-rooted in our biology. We can't do anything about it. You see, we're just survival machines. We're survival machines for our genes, as Richard Dawkins would put it.
Of those genes and pass them on. And so I use this phrase survival machine. A body, an individual, is a survival machine. And that's by far the most powerful way of interpreting what an individual organism is. An individual organism is a throwaway survival machine for the self-replicating coded information which it contains. And the fate of that coded information is crucially bound up with the fate of the body in which it sits. If the body in which it sits dies before reproducing, then that coded information is not going to go on for the next generation and the next, and potentially for tens of millions of years.
Our genes want to continue replicating for thousands and thousands of years. And this is precisely why you find certain people more attractive than others. The reason we are the way we are, the reason we act the way we do and behave the way we do, the reason we think the way we think, the reason why we find certain people attractive, the reason why we do everything is just so we can reproduce eventually and our genes can continue replicating. The reason you find someone attractive is because your genes are telling you that an offspring with that individual will likely lead to that offspring being able to have offspring themselves, leading to future replication of the genes, more longevity for the genes. This is known as the sexy son hypothesis.
But there's also sexual selection pressure moving towards larger and larger feathers. So why would the peahens choose males with large feathers and ornaments? Darwin himself had one theory, and that's one of the two main hypotheses for this question. He thought, because of arbitrary beauty standards, different in every species, he thought the peahens choose the brightest and the largest feathers just because they, quote-unquote, like them. They just fancy them. They like bright, shiny, symmetrical colors and feathers. So it's purely arbitrary beauty standard. As a peahen, if you then all of a sudden choose to go against the grain and not choose a mate with the brightest and largest colors, which will mean your sons all of a sudden do not get the genes for beauty and your sons will leave less offspring. So it is a runaway effect, a positive feedback loop, also called the sexy son hypothesis. Yes, evolutionary biologists love their funny nicknames, but it's literally called the sexy son hypothesis because you want to make sure your sons get the genes for the beauty standards within your species.
So again, it's not your fault that you're more attracted to certain people rather than others. This is something deep-rooted in our biology. There's nothing you can do about it. And this goes far beyond race. And even if we're exploring race itself, race is actually a lot more complex than skin tone. Race doesn't just impact skin tone. Race impacts the whole phenotype.
Race is deeper than the color of one's skin. Certain physical traits are mostly common to certain races or phenotypes, a sort of subclassification of race, which is why you can determine the race of each of these albinos. For example, the average white man will tend to have thinner lips. The average black man tends to have a lower nasal bridge and broader nose. Approximately 50% of the East Asian population does not have an upper eyelid crease. They are said to have a single eyelid, such as the one you see above to the left. In East Asian eyelids in which the lid crease is present, such as the one seen bottom left, the crease is typically located lower than in the Caucasian eyelid. Certain traits that men of a particular race or phenotype may have may not be attractive to women of another, or increasingly, the same race or phenotype. This isn't necessarily born out of prejudice in the former case or self-hate in the latter, but preference. But the fact remains, women might reject you because of traits that you have typical of your race or phenotype. There are even greater differences between different races underneath the skin that have an impact on the proportions of the face and soft tissue of the face.
And when you understand this concept, you see that it becomes less about race, especially race as society generally understands race as, but it becomes more about genetics in general, genetics overall as a whole. For example, there's many ways you could perceive and quantify selective pressure in real time. A prime example of this would be height. And these changes, now more than ever, are actually rapidly accelerating at an exponential rate. This is very observable when it comes to height, and a perfectly quantifiable example. A common misconception is that this is due to nutritional advantages in the common day, but this couldn't be farther from the truth. First of all, we weren't famished as a species 100 years ago. This is simply selective pressure. It's happening in real time, and it's happening now more than ever. And now you might ask, why has it been accelerating now more than ever? And a lot of it comes down to new technologies, but especially the fact that women in general can now provide for themselves in comparison to years ago where this wasn't as common. The more women are able to provide for themselves, the less likely they are to search for a partner with providing abilities, and more likely they are to search for a partner specifically for their genes, how attracted, how in love they are with a partner. And just to clarify, the point of this video isn't to discuss that topic as a whole. I'm just trying to make an observation why things are the way they are. And this leads me to explain why hypergamy now more than ever has reached an all-time high. Because women are no longer settling for men simply for their providing abilities, they're simply searching for the top echelon of genetically superior men. And since those top few percentages of men are getting all of the female attention, they're very unlikely to decide to settle with one particular woman, and this is no surprise why infidelity rates have skyrocketed in the past 20 years especially. And of course, new technologies, things like social media and dating apps, are only compounding this even further. And as a consequence to this, not only are people changing more physically than ever in history, but they're changing more emotionally ever in history before. More people than ever are unhappy. Self-delete rates are higher than ever, especially amongst men. Divorce rates are higher. More people are depressed. Of course, there's other factors, but the most impactful one is hypergamy. But it's not only the men who are unhappy because of hypergamy, aside from that top echelon of men, but even less women than before are now becoming unhappy because they're competing for the same men, and those same men are less likely to settle for them. Of course, this isn't for every single instance, this is just generally speaking now compared to the past. When you observe an environment in the world where there's less factors contributing to hypergamy, you'll notice that people in general tend to be happier. Whether this is in a country with different technologies or different customs, or if you're just observing the past, you'll tend to notice that in general, people tend to be more happier in those environments than the current present day one where hypergamy is at its highest level. Look, I'm not saying we need to change anything. I'm not saying we should change anything. I'm not saying we even can change anything. I believe that we've opened a Pandora's box and these things are simply irreversible. I'm simply making a video explaining to you why the world is the way it is. I'm explaining why we're changing more now than ever, both physically and emotionally. And most importantly, that it's nobody's fault. So don't blame yourself and don't blame society. Don't blame anyone else. It was inevitable. Little did the failed Austrian painter know, forceful eugenics was never the answer to enhance a population. Not only was it immoral, but objectively speaking, it clearly wasn't sustainable. On the other hand, hypergamy is.